So was the Buddha fully human, or a kind of a divine being? We find elements of both descriptions in the early texts, but I want to get into that in a little bit more detail and show how the development may have occurred. Coming right up. I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing. So was the Buddha fully human, or did he have divine aspects, or was he really a kind of a semi-divine or even a fully divine being? We find elements of both of these in the early texts, and that's what I'm going to get into in this video. Now, what I'm going to do, first of all, is go into a little bit of caveats about what I mean by this, because there are aspects that I want to leave to one side before I get to the main part of the talk. And the reason I think that this kind of investigation is useful is that if you go to a talk about Buddhism or the Buddha's teachings from any school of Buddhism, you're going to have aspects of both of these. And they can be confusing at times. They can seem to be contradictory or clash or not to fit together very well. Those are things that have concerned me when I was first going to talks about Buddhism. And so understanding in a little bit more detail about the specifics can, I think, be helpful in at least getting our minds around some of the things that might confuse us. I'm going to leave out the later teachings. I'm not talking about anything that's after the really early teachings, the teachings we find in the Pali Canon. I'm also going to be leaving aside the supposed magical abilities, superhuman abilities that the Buddha achieved by dedicated practice. There are various of these called the Iddhis that the Buddha supposedly achieved, and it's quite a separate issue as to what we deal with those, how we deal with those, because those are at least potentially supposed to be the kinds of things that any of us could achieve if we did the same kinds of practices the Buddha did. And in fact, in the early texts, many other people are able to achieve those Iddhis, those kinds of abilities. And so while those are kind of superhuman, they're supernatural in a way, they're not going to be they're also not going to be the subject of this talk. Instead, I'm going to be looking at the aspects that seem to pick out the Buddha as somebody more than simply a normal human. That he was not simply another one of other humans, but he was something special. And that therefore that his abilities were somehow stemmed from the extraordinary character of him as an individual, that is, by not being really fully human, rather than from the kind of practice that any human could have done in his place. So in these early texts, the Buddha is sometimes described as being superhuman or having superhuman abilities. And this can be understood in two ways. The first way is that he had these Iddhis, that he had these supernatural powers, or that he had meditative powers that were not normal. For example, being able to achieve deep states of meditative absorption. Those were considered supernatural, or I shouldn't say supernatural, but superhuman powers in the early texts. They were called that. But in saying that, what they didn't mean was that he wasn't human. What it meant was that they were powers that were more than ordinary. There's this deeper sense of being superhuman or not human, which is what we'll get to today. So there's a kind of an implicit contradiction in the early texts. On the one hand, the Buddha is described as being, as I say, fully human. And on the other, there are aspects of him that aren't. So let's turn to the first. There's ways in which the Buddha is really described as being a completely ordinary human being. Before he attained awakening, the young Gautama is described, he describes himself as being intoxicated with worldly pleasures, being interested in the life of the senses, in his home life when he was in various palaces that his father had built, and enjoyed the company of lots of different people. He was entertained by women playing instruments. And all of this is to say that there's nothing in his early life, at least in the descriptions in these early texts, that would indicate that he didn't have a quite normal youth. And then later on, when he decides to leave the palace, he says that he was afraid at night when he went to meditate in the forests. He was ordinarily startled and afraid of the sounds that he would hear at night. He had deep kinds of feelings of wanting to leave those forests, and he had to overcome them. He also, of course, as many of us will know, spent many, many years trying to find the right path. That is to say, he was confused. He portrays himself as having been deeply, deeply confused about the way to go forward when he left home. How was he going to achieve awakening? Well, he went through lots and lots of different options, trying different practices, finding out that those practices did not work. And in so doing, he pursued a lot of dead ends, which is to say that he did not have any kind of clear idea from the beginning of which way to go. It's clear that at least he does not portray himself as having a clear a clear wisdom of the way to proceed from the beginning. Instead, he really had to try all the options before he ended up with the right option, with the right path. So that's him before he became awakened. And then after having become awakened, the Buddha also is described, and describes himself at various times, as having many of the ordinary kinds of concerns of a human. That is to say, we have him having back pain. He had bad back pain. There is a time when he had to allow another one of his monastics, I believe it was Ananda, to finish a talk that he was going to give because he was in too much pain. He had to go and lie down. He clearly did not like the noise that the monastics would make. So there's an example of him having a group of monks coming to come and talk with him, but they were making too much noise. And so in what certainly seems for all the world to be a type of irritation, tells them that they're making too much noise and they should all go off and practice somewhere else, that he wanted to be left in peace. I discussed on a previous video about how the Buddha came to his decision to allow nuns, female monastics, into the order. And in this example, he initially decided not to. When he was asked by his foster mother to allow nuns, he said no. And it was only after the intercession of his attendant Ananda on their behalf, and indeed some pretty serious discussion between the two of them, only after that did the Buddha sort of relent. Because Ananda eventually asked him, well, look, is there any reason why women can't attain awakening? And the Buddha admitted that there was not, that women were just as capable of attaining awakening as men were. And at that point, Ananda said, well, look, why don't you let the nuns practice then with us? And he relented. And I think this is almost more than anything else an example of the Buddha's humanity. We might even say of his fallibility. And by being fallible, by being willing to change his mind, by being in a position where he realized that he had made a mistake, at least at some level, is an example of humanity. And finally, when at the end of his life, he portrays himself, or is portrayed in the text, as admitting to having a number of the pains and sicknesses of old age, of undergoing them and of feeling those kinds of pains, of having to sort of knit himself together, as it were, like he says, like a cart, the way an old cart is sort of strapped together so it won't fall apart. That's how he sort of felt. And all of these, I think, are examples of his humanity, rather than of him being a kind of idealized, an idealized being. On the other side, however, we have a relatively small number of suttas, but a real number, a not zero, that describe him as being something more than simply human. One of the most famous of these is called the Acharya Bhutta Sutta, or the Sutta on the Incredible and the Amazing, where Ananda is discussing a number of the Buddha's incredible qualities to the Buddha in a group environment. And one of the stanzas of this goes this way. discussing the Buddha, Ananda says, as soon as he's born, the Bodhisattva, that is the Buddha before his awakening, stands firm with his own feet on the ground. Facing north, he takes 7 strides with a white parasol held above him, surveys all quarters, and makes this dramatic statement: I am the foremost in the world. I am the eldest in the world. I am the best in the world. This is my last rebirth. Now there are no more future lives. And this is probably the most famous of these kinds of statements we find in the early texts, because it really does seem to indicate that the Buddha is more than simply human. That is, immediately upon being born, he stands up, he walks around, he gives a big statement about his perfection, if you like. And these are things, of course, that an ordinary human simply cannot do. And so, based upon this text, many people do take the early text as saying that the Buddha is not simply a human being. I think it's worth saying, at least in passing, that in this text, the exact way that this is supposed to be taken is not entirely clear. Ananda is saying a number of things about the Buddha's greatness, and might be taken to be being a little bit over the top. And it's not clear from the Buddha's reaction whether the Buddha isn't sort of smiling and saying this is kind of a funny, perhaps somewhat humorous kind of overstatement in the way that one tends to do for people who are in positions of power and greatness. And again, it's not clear from the context of this sutta whether the Buddha is really endorsing literally this description, or whether he's simply smiling and saying this is kind of a funny way for Ananda to be praising me. Nevertheless, because there's room for different interpretations of the sutta, there certainly is room to take this as a literal description of what the Buddha was like just after he was born. Now, there's another sutta called the Lakkhana Sutta, where what's described are what's called the 32 marks of a great man. And these are 32 physical marks on the Buddha's body, or indeed supposedly on the body of any great human, any great man actually, that mark them out as special, that mark them out as an individual who's, again, more than simply human. These include things like having a 1,000-spoked wheel on the soles of his feet, on looking a certain way, on having certain male sexual organs in a certain way, and having a long tongue. I mean, very weird. Some of it's very weird to us today, but in the context of ancient India, these would have been taken to be marks of greatness. And I discussed these in an earlier video about whether the Buddha was bald. I'll put a link to that up on the screen if you're interested in seeing more detail about that. But in short, this is contradicted, this description here is contradicted by a couple of other suttas in which the Buddha is displayed as being completely ordinary looking. In other words, a king has to be told who he is to pick him out of the crowd of monastics. Or in another sutta, one of his followers spends the night with him in a small hut and doesn't know that he's with the Buddha. He thinks he's with another monastic. And these are examples of where it's pretty clear from the text that the Buddha didn't look any way out of the ordinary. Now, the scholar Analio has suggested that these are actually not meant to be those kinds of things that we can see easily. They may kind of be like tea leaf reading by Brahmin specialists. In other words, you don't literally have a 1,000-spoked wheel on your foot, but a Brahmin specialist can sort of read the tea leaves of the lines on your foot and say, that's a 1,000-spoked wheel. And so there may be an aspect of that as well, where these things were prescribed, or this description was given of the Buddha, but it's not the kind of thing that you could actually see ordinarily. And in the latter case, in this case, again, there's less of a pull to say that the Buddha is really superhuman or not human. It's rather that the interpretation is sort of subtle. But in any event, taking the description that these marks would be visible, the Buddhist scholar Bhante Sujato has had this to say, which I think is really quite correct. He says, when we see a clearly mythic notion like the 32 marks, which contradicts the known facts that the Buddha had a normal physique, then we know it's an invention, whose basis is to be explained by the needs, wishes, and motivations of the redactors. And I think we can say this with respect both to the 32 marks and to the claim that the Buddha stood up and walked around. It's possible that both of these went back to the historical Buddha, and it's possible that again, that the story of Ananda was kind of supposed to be kind of funny, and it's possible that the 32 marks are not the sorts of things you ordinarily can see, but that then later on, these stories took on lives of their own. And it's also possible that these were stories that came after the Buddha's death, that were written by people who had not seen the Buddha directly, and so could not contradict the claims that he looked strange, and could not contradict the claims that he stood up the moment after he was born. Now, the scholar Analayo, when looking into the development of the Bodhisattva ideal, he has a paper about that, which is really quite fascinating. He basically has a lot to say about the developments of the idea of the Buddha after the Buddha passed on. And the idea being that after the Buddha passed on, there would have been a vacuum, a kind of a vacuum in place, because the teacher had left. And many people would have looked back to this lack of a teacher and tried to fill it with what we might call idealized or hagiographic stories in his place. And these stories would have been intended to make the Buddha as more than simply an ordinary human, as basically an object of clinging by the people who constructed the stories, and in a way to try to bring the Buddha back into their lives more directly. Because if the Buddha was more than simply human, then the Buddha might actually still be around today, or might have been around at their time. And this leads to weird developments, like the claim that the Buddha was, or at least implicitly seems to have been awakened at birth. In other words, at birth he was able to say that this was his last life, which again implies that he was either awakened at birth or was aware of his awakening at birth, which is very strange. And indeed, as I say, contradicts much of his own story about his path towards awakening that are still told really in quite some detail in many texts. What we're left with is a kind of a development from a human Buddha, from a human Gautama, into one that's more deified, more godlike with time. So while these early texts do have these implicit contradictions, at least depending on how we interpret them, within themselves, they also, I think, do lead towards a potential solution of this contradiction. Now, the scholar Analayo talks about this distinction, or this solution, when he talks about the development of this Buddha ideal becoming something of a Bodhisattva ideal, where what he says is that this achievement of the Buddha, this achievement of awakening that the Buddha supposedly did through long-term practice, through trying these various paths, then through the telling of this story, in particular of the story of Ananda, of the Buddha's birth, that whole struggle becomes more told as something that's the birthright of the Bodhisattva, as Analayo puts it. It becomes that awakening is simply the birthright of a sort of a being who is more than simply human. We do find this kind of process continuing on beyond the Buddha's lifetime into later texts and into later schools and into later thoughts about Buddhism. So if you find this talk useful, consider giving it a thumbs up, subscribing. If you want to help out the work that I'm doing on this channel, please do check out my Patreon page. And thanks to all of my patrons on Patreon. It's wonderful to have your support. I hope that we'll catch you on the next one of these videos, and meanwhile, do be well.